Welcome to today's webinar featuring Roy Swan, hosted by CFA Society Chicago's Distinguished Speaker Series Advisory Group. Information on upcoming events can be found on the Society's website at www.cfachicago.org. All mics for attendees will automatically be muted during the event. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature. This event is being recorded. We will begin the event with remarks from Roy Swan. Jeremy Heer, CFA, co-chair of the Distinguished Speaker Series Advisory Group, will then join us to moderate questions from attendees. Roy Swan leads the Ford Foundation's Mission Investments team. He is responsible for approximately $1.3 billion in capital dedicated to advancing social justice and addressing inequality through impact investing. Before joining the Ford Foundation, he was managing director and co-head of global sustainable finance at Morgan Stanley. His Morgan Stanley team committed over $13 billion of the firm's capital to community development transactions. Roy is a current or past board member of numerous nonprofits, including the Dalton School, the Partnership for After-School Education, and the Morgan Stanley Foundation. Roy continues to serve as a general partner and board member of Morgan Stanley's SBA-licensed Small Business Investment Company, an entity he co-founded in 2014. I will now turn it over to today's guest speaker, Roy Swan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. I'm Roy Swan, head of the Ford Foundation's Mission Investments Program, and I'm really excited about this opportunity to present to the CFA Society Chicago today. Some of you may know, I was originally scheduled to make this presentation at a luncheon in Chicago on April 1st. But COVID-19 had other plans. One thing I will say is, had we seen each other in Chicago on April 1st, my hair would have been much shorter. I normally wear it quite close to the gills. And speaking of gills, and on the topic of hair, a buddy of mine asked me if I was going for the Artist Gilmore Afro look. Some of you may remember Artist Gilmore, who was drafted by the Chicago Bulls back in '71, the early days of the Afro, and he wore it well. And I'm almost there, but I digress because I'm here to talk about the Ford Foundation's Mission Investments Program, which is a multifaceted program with 3 types of capital. Today, I'm only going to cover mission-related investment endowment, also known as MRI. MRI is the part of the Ford Foundation's endowment that makes double bottom line investments for financial and social returns. And so just to focus on MRI and save time for Q&A, I'll be saving a lot of slides, skipping a lot of slides, but you'll be sent the full presentation deck later. And with that, we can move on to slide 2, please. So first, I want to acknowledge the moment we're in. And it's a bit like living through a combination of 3 tumultuous periods: the 1918 flu pandemic, the Great Depression, and the civil rights unrest of the 1960s, which is what we're experiencing in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy. There'll be more on that later in the presentation, but now let's move on to slide 3 and our introduction of the Ford Foundation, which was founded in 1936 in Detroit, Michigan. We received our last contributions from the estates of Henry and Edsel Ford in 1947, moved to New York City in 1953, and our mission is to address the root causes and consequences of inequality in all its forms. Our endowment has been hovering around 12 or 13 billion over the past year or so, and we've been experiencing the market volatility that everyone else has. Next slide 4. This slide shows the 11 offices around the world, concentrated in the global South when we're outside the US. Next slide, 5. Excuse me, the next slide. This is our diverse team. I have 9 super talented colleagues who handle grant making and investments in the US and the global South, regions all around our offices. So that's our team. Next slide, please. This slide contains what I call the Ford Foundation's capitalist tools. And we have the first 3 of those tools on my team: the grants, program-related investments, and mission-related investment endowment. So as mentioned, I'll be skipping around a bit, so we can skip to, I believe it's slide 13. Maybe it's 12, I'm sorry. So 12, 13, go to 13, please, let's see. 14, maybe. I think maybe things may have changed a bit. Sorry about this. So what is this, what is the MRI thing? Why is it such a big deal? Go to the next slide, please, slide 15. You know, why did it land on the front page of the New York Times when it was announced back on April 13, 2017? And why does the headline of the article say that the Ford Foundation is an unlikely convert to impact investing? Well, here's why. Some of you may be aware of the somewhat cynical description of a foundation. Some people say a foundation is nothing more than a typical private investment company that happens to have a side gig giving away money. There's also the rumor of the healthcare foundation dedicated to the defeat of lung cancer, whose endowment is invested in tobacco stocks because they generate great returns. And I don't know if that rumor is true, but if it is, it would be a bit awkward, to say the least. Let's go to the next slide, 15. So here's why the Ford Foundation's MRI program was such big news. For most foundations, many of you may know this, 95% of their assets are used to generate financial returns and 5% are used to advance their mission. The Ford Foundation wasn't the first foundation to say, what about the other 95%? Why can't more of that be used for mission? But we are one of the oldest and perhaps the most traditional foundations in the world. So even though we weren't the first to do it, it was big news. And that's why it made the front page of the business section of the New York Times. We've also made the largest MRI commitment of all foundations. So let's skip the next several slides and go to, I believe, slide 20. Let's try 21. Yeah, let's stay there for a minute. But I do want to say, for the record, our MRI endowment is subject to the same prudent investment standards as our traditional endowment. And like our traditional endowment, we have a dedicated committee of the board responsible for oversight of our work. So this slide 20 shows our MRI strategies. They're affordable housing, biotech, et cetera. You see them there on the page. Each of those strategies sprung from problems we're trying to address in line with our mission. And we'll cover the problems and the strategies in more detail a little later. On the next slide, I'll talk a bit about financial returns. For any perpetual foundation like the Ford Foundation, the financial return hurdle is the foundation's spend rate plus inflation. The legal minimum spend rate is 5%, as I mentioned earlier, but the Ford Foundation historically often exceeds that minimum, and for the last, as long as we can remember, we've exceeded that minimum. And when you add our spend rate plus inflation, our hurdle rate for an endowment investment is about 8%. And I just want to add a side note here for a moment. I'm excluding from that calculation. There was another big announcement we made on June 11th that the Ford Foundation will double our spend rate for the next couple of years, fueled by a first of its kind social justice bond. If you haven't heard about it, Ford and other leading foundations have decided to increase their spending, given the implications and consequences of COVID-19. And to fund that spending, the Ford Foundation issued a first of its kind $1 billion social justice bond. You can Google that or follow up with me later if you want to learn more about that. But that $1 billion, there were two tranches. Ford Foundation is a AAA credit. 300 million of the bonds sold at a 30-year maturity and a rate of 2.415%. 700 million had 50-year maturity and sold at a coupon rate of 2.815%. But I can follow up with anyone on that more later. You can do the search. Let's go back to the matter at hand. This, as the slide indicates there, the average foundation achieved a 6.2% return over the 3-year period, 2016 to 2018. So an 8% hurdle is not an easy target. And while our board has not placed a specific return requirement on the MRI endowment, our team, as a team, we hope to achieve our hurdle rate while generating positive social impact at the same time. Let's go to the next slide. On this slide, I just want to take a minute to clarify a common misperception we hear quite a bit in the market. That misperception is that all MRIs, and PRIs for that matter, that's a different topic, but all are automatically concessionary or made with the expectation of below market returns. That is not accurate. And in our team, we underwrite our MRIs to achieve risk-adjusted market rates of return. And there are different underwriting standards with different folks, but the point here is mission-related investment does not automatically mean concessionary. Let's go to slide 26, please. This slide, actually 20, go back one, thank you. I've adjusted to the additional slide. So this slide shows our investments, and what's missing from the slide, unfortunately, is the corresponding impact strategies. In the hard copy you will receive, it'll show the check marks for where each of these strategies fit. So for example, with Axion, Quona, it would show financial inclusion, and the other box checked off would also be diverse owned firms. And when you see the hard copy, what you'll see is that the column with the most check marks is diverse owned firms. And that's really a reflection of the importance we place on diversity. It's included in our general due diligence questionnaire, and it's also a specific strategy that we have to deal with a specific social problem. Let's now go to slide 28. So we'll deal with each of those topics in turn. Why invest in affordable housing? Well, 43% of American renters spend over 50% of their income on rent. They should only be spending 30% of their income if they were to have a healthy household financial situation. The shortage of affordable housing units is 7.2 million and growing, and that's in the US, to be clear. So America is in an affordable housing crisis. Our investment managers work very hard to preserve the shrinking supply of affordable housing, with a special emphasis on providing value-adding social services to improve the lives of residents. Next slide, please. Why financial inclusion? Well, billions of low-income people around the world are left out of the formal financial system. Our investment managers help them get access to products like low-cost remittances, personal savings and credit products, payment plans for educational and healthcare costs, healthcare and life insurance coverage, ag tech finance, and other products and services that help pave the way to economic prosperity. Next slide, please. Okay, why quality jobs? After a flourishing period from the end of World War II until about 1980, American workers have suffered. Real wages for the top 1% of American population have increased by 176%, while real wages for the bottom 90% actually declined by 3%. So we've partnered with MIT Sloan School's Good Jobs Institute to figure out how can companies pursue superior operational design and superior human capital investment at the same time. There aren't many private equity firms with a quality jobs focus today, but we hope to change that. We've got one manager working on that so far. That's HCAP Partners, which you see on the slide. And HCAP has generated great results so far. Next slide, please. Now, at the opening of this presentation, I talked about the moment we're in. And the next few slides cover the very sensitive race topic. We're very uncomfortable talking about race in America. But as Ford Foundation President Darren Walker has said, progress won't come without us being uncomfortable. So as uncomfortable as this might feel for some of us, I ask everyone to bear with me for a few minutes as I talk about this sensitive and uncomfortable topic. And I'm doing this because it's tied to one of our strategies, and I think it's important to our work as asset owners and institutional asset managers. And with that, the next slide, please. So the plain and jarring fact is that our American system was designed to be racist, and wealth inequality is an inevitable consequence of that design. American history includes enslavement of Black Americans, wage theft, violent takings by government agencies and white vigilantes, government wealth transfers to white Americans, white immigrants, Jim Crow laws, discrimination, conscious, unconscious bias, so on and so on. Much of America's racist history is hidden. For example, when Michael Bloomberg was a presidential candidate and he visited Tulsa, Oklahoma, Tulsa is the site of a brutal massacre of Black Americans by white mobs about 100 years ago. And here's what Michael Bloomberg said. He said, I read a lot of history, I took a lot of history courses, but I'd never heard about this until I got here. And there are a lot more stories of violence, oppression, discrimination that are hidden in history. And I want to turn back to Darren Walker's words because I love the way he puts this, and I quote it directly from a recent New York Times article he written. That is this: no chief executive, investor, or rich person wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror and says, today I'm going to go out and I'm going to be racist, I'm going to go create more inequality in America. End of this quote. But here's the problem. Even if we aren't doing things that would actively increase inequality, if we do nothing, we're preserving inequality. The only way to undo inequality is to actually do something to undo it. To undo it, we first have to face it. And as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And on that note, I feel encouraged, greatly encouraged today Because in the aftermath of the George Floyd tragedy, people here in America and all over the world are facing the truth. Here in America, we've seen white Americans out in the streets marching toward the North Star of moral and economic justice alongside Black Americans. Now, there's a long road ahead, but where there's a will, there's a way. And it's going to take a lot of capital. We can all join the march. And in the next few slides, I'll talk about what we all can do as part of the march forward. Okay, next slide, please. One of the consequences of all that systemic racism and historic oppression is that it has created a $23 trillion challenge. That $23 trillion is a rough and incomplete estimate of the cost placed upon Black Americans as a consequence of systemic racism. Bob Johnson, founder of Black Entertainment Television, also known as BET, he came up with 14 trillion of that amount based on simple math of how much more wealth Black Americans would have if we had the same average wealth as white Americans. That 9.5 trillion figure is the amount of capital Black American investment managers would have under their control if capital was allocated fairly. What is not included in this figure is the hundreds of billions or maybe even trillions of bank loan capital that has not gone to Black Americans. And here's where we all come into the picture. As asset owners and institutional investment managers, we can all do something about the 9.5 trillion part of that equation. And the next slide may give some ideas. On this slide, the problem statement in the upper left-hand corner is really a bit of an embarrassing failure when you think about it in the context of a well-functioning capitalist system. Why is that? Well, access to capital is the lifeblood of capitalism, the source of health, prosperity, social stability, national security. In the US, women and minorities who make up 70% of the population have access to about 1% of the 71 trillion in assets under management in the US. That means that white men who make up about 30% of the population control 99% of that $71 trillion. That imbalance isn't just startlingly unfair, it is devastatingly destructive to Black Americans because white men tend to invest with other white men based on statistics. And so the Ford Foundation has been working to fix that imbalance by welcoming diverse firms to come to us with their proposals, with their investment funds. As you can see here, 31 of our 37 investment managers in our portfolio so far are owned at least 25% by women and people of color. On the next slide, you'll see, so here you'll see that my team has outperformed that general market diversity metric, which you saw on the previous slide, by a factor of 51 times. That is 1% versus the Ford Foundation's MRI endowment, 57% invested in firms owned by women and people of color, where they own at least 25% of the firm. Now, that may sound like an impressive feat, but it's a very low bar. So really, by sharing our results, what we're hoping is that others will join with us in being open to the proposals of diverse fund managers, especially Black American investment managers who face so many obstacles as we've discussed. And if you pick well, if you pick the right managers, it won't cost you anything, and you may actually do better. Harvard Business School professor Josh Lerner and Robert Rabin of the Rabin Group can tell you all about the fact that Black American investment managers perform on average at or better than the average white American investment manager. So let's move on to slide 36, or excuse me, 37. So now we're moving on to, now that we're over that very sensitive and uncomfortable race topic, moving on to general lessons learned in our MRI activities. First, there have been questions about the existence of investment managers authentically focused on positive social impact and market rate returns. Do those types of investors exist? The answer, based on our what we've learned, is an unequivocal yes. Second, that is our team, we wonder whether it is more expensive to operate an impact fund compared with a traditional fund because of the cost of impact measurements and reporting metrics, or whether that extra work and cost actually drives higher financial returns. And then third, it appears to us that the traditional 10-year private equity term structure with its 3 to 5 year holding periods may encourage behaviors that have bad consequences for the long-term health of businesses and employees, especially in the buyout context. Next, let's go to slide 39. So this slide talks about my 3 measures of success. One is double bottom line performance, raised awareness of mission-related investments and impact investing, and increased participation in impact investing. Next slide, please. So on the double bottom line thing, given the typical J curve for venture capital and private equity investments, and the fact that we're investing our $1 billion over a 10-year period, we'll know the answer to our impact expectations before we know the results of our financial performance. Next slide, please. On this slide, when we talked about raising awareness and adoption of impact investing and inclusive capitalism in the business world, we've got on the left here on this slide, Mr. Chicago School of Economics himself, Milton Friedman. It's taken us 50 years to get from Friedman's widely adopted opinion that the role of the corporation is to maximize profits to today, where the Business Roundtable has renounced shareholder primacy and embraced a form of stakeholder capitalism that was announced by Jamie Dimon less than a year ago. Next slide, please. So on the topic, again, continue on the topic of raising awareness, the good news is we've already got, there's already 2 Harvard Business School case studies written on our work. So a crop of future business leaders will learn about our efforts in the classroom. Next slide, please. Finally, it's increasing the number of participants in impact investing. Our $1 billion MRI commitment is puny compared with the cost of the social problems that we want to help fix. And so we want to encourage other foundations, sovereign wealth funds, public pension funds, labor pension funds, other like-minded investors to allocate more capital to impact and mission-related investments. Next slide, please. So our goal is to harness the forces of capitalism for the benefit of the common good. And we want to do well financially and do good for society and planet. And I think this quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and our virtuous cycle of capital on this slide appropriately summarize our mission to help advance a more inclusive form of capitalism through our mission investments program. Next slide, please. So with that brings the formal presentation to a close, and I want to say thanks again and I look forward to you all joining us on this journey. We welcome questions now, and so I think we've got some time left, about 30 minutes left for Q&A.
All right, well, that was a great presentation. Thanks very much. Roy, I really appreciate it. I've got a few questions on here. I'd encourage everybody to ask questions through the Q&A function here on Zoom. I'll start with the first one. It would be great to hear your thoughts about the concept of additionality and how that impacts the Ford Foundation's decisions.
Yeah, I guess I don't know what additionality, I don't know what that means. So, or in this context, so I would need a little more help on that.
Right, so additionality, I hadn't heard the term either, so I did a quick search. The example I've been given is emission reductions are additional if they occur because of the incentives associated with the existence of greenhouse gas markets. So these sorts of investments would have additionality if they occur because there are incentives outside of the regular system for them.
Okay.
So,
yeah. So I'm not sure I can answer that question well, and maybe there can be a follow-up. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to achieve our mission by having specific strategies where we intentionally provide capital and intentionally disclose our activities in a way that those who have achieved the moral resolve that they would like to use more of their own capital to address specific social problems and make money, we want to provide an example, and we hope that people will learn from our successes and failures, because we're not expecting to be perfect. We have a bias for action. We know we'll make mistakes along the way.
Okay, so we have additionality means not just investing in a good business, but actually changing the actions of the business to do more good things. So we're talking about the impact of behavior, the business's behavior. So
yeah. So that's okay. So our board of trustees had us focus on private markets activity because of the corporate governance characteristics of private market activity versus public market activity. That is to say, we believe it's easier to drive change and drive behaviors through private market activities as opposed to the proxy process. So our quality jobs mandate or strategy is an example of that. We hope to increase the amount of capital that flows in a way that has management boards focus on superior operational design, superior human capital investment. That is to say, treating employees as valuable assets as opposed to fungible expenses. That's the type of behavior change that we hope to accomplish out of just that one example, our quality jobs strategy.
Okay, very excellent. All right, I think that answers the question. Thank you. The next one here from Regina. Does MRI include startup funds? Many institutions have minimum AUM thresholds for asset managers they'll consider. And would you consider seeding new managers?
Yeah. So we basically have a program-related investment strategy which provides additional capital for us to help first-time managers that may not have a traditional profile that we believe fits with our endowment capital mandate. That is not to say that we would not use our endowment capital to invest in first-time managers. One of the things we've done is we've provided capital to a couple of fund of funds, Fairview Capital Partners and Plexo Capital. Those two entities have the staff that can help us accelerate our investments, and they specialize in earlier stage funds. So through those funds of funds, we're able to make investments in first time funds. So we're really open to looking at all, every proposal, and it's really a case by case basis.
Okay, great. I've got a couple questions about sourcing. How do you source or get introduced to diverse managers? How do you expand to the pipeline of women and minority owned firms? Seems like everyone kind of has one or two groups they can name. Ends up being the same one or two groups a lot of the time. So how do you build that kind of broad funnel?
Yeah, well, we have to start with the team of people investing the capital at the Ford Foundation. So the mission investments team, which you saw, is a very diverse team. What happens when you have a diverse team is you have a diverse network. So I think the Ford Foundation was very interested in having a diverse team because they knew what came with that was knowledge of diverse people. I mean, one statistic that is stunning to some extent, not a surprise to others, is that 75% of white people don't have a single black friend in their network. And so when you really think about it, that explains a lot when it comes to understanding how to find diverse managers. And that's just the race example. So we have a diverse team, we have diverse networks. People see the Ford Foundation Mission Investments Program as a friendly place. We have no shortage of emails coming in from around the world, trust me. But we also had an intentional strategy of accelerating our ability to reach diverse managers, which is why we allocated capital to Fairview Capital Partners, which has been around since 1994. It was the first fund of funds created with a specific strategy to help diverse managers gain access to capital. And Plexo Capital, which is a spin out from Google Ventures, which Google Ventures also focused on diverse managers, and Lo Tony spun out Plexo Capital to become a standalone institutional investor to help institutional investors, asset owners, find diverse managers. So I can, whoever's interested, please follow up with me afterwards. I'd be very happy to expand the network.
Excellent. Okay, that was really good. Thank you very much. The top of my question and answer list now I have, how does the Ford Foundation think about over time constructing the entire portfolio, the 13 billion, using the same proactive diversity goals as this MRI portion of it, right? I mean, over time, you kind of think that the whole thing would eventually get pointed in that direction.
Yeah, well, I think as time goes on and we demonstrate our performance, I think, the whole world will benefit because we're going to make special efforts, and this is the brilliance and beauty of the Harvard Business School case studies. We want to make special efforts to be completely transparent about what's happening with our activities. Research, Professor Josh Lerner, I can't speak better than him. Professor Josh Lerner is a capital markets expert, investments expert at Harvard Business School. There have been studies over the decades that demonstrate diverse managers, particularly African-American managers, because I think the focus was there, perform at or better than average white male managed firm. So I think the data points, the more people become aware of them, they've been around for decades. Professor Josh Lerner is just the most recent. The more people become aware, the more likelihood that will influence decision making.
Okay, that makes sense. We had a question come through. What's the max leverage you'd be comfortable putting on the endowment? Right, you're doing social bonds. So how much would you put on there?
Well, that, unfortunately, I can't answer that question, but I'll give some background. So the CFO and the president would make, and the board of trustees would make the decision around the amount of leverage. What I do know is that with deep study involving the two co-lead underwriters, Morgan Stanley and Wells Fargo, a lot of work was done figuring out what they thought the cost of capital would be. And at the end of the day, the cost of capital was so attractive that it made more sense to raise capital than to spend down our endowment to increase our the additional spending we'd like to do. So the cost benefit made it really attractive to raise capital. The capital is not being used at all for investment purposes. I just want to be clear. It is being used 100% for grant making globally to deal with the implications of the COVID-19 consequences.
Right. Okay. I've had a couple questions about vehicles. I have one. Are you for the most part a fund-of-fund investor? I have another one about do you do only through funds, or do you direct investments in companies? And if you do those, how do you source those? If you could talk a little bit about the different vehicles you use and how sourcing might differ between them.
Yep. So at the moment, so let me start by we have a pretty broad capability. At the moment, because of the size of our team and we believe that the best way to invest right now is through funds, and that's either other private equity funds or funds of funds, venture capital, et cetera. As time goes on, we may make investments in individual companies. Our program is 3 years old. We're just getting started. For now, we feel like we're able to be very efficient by making investments in other funds. So I would say, yes, we probably do look like a fund of funds. Well, not probably. We are a fund of funds, so to speak. But as time goes on, we may make individual investments in individual companies.
Okay. Couple more related questions to that. When you identify a worthwhile project, do you try to identify additional capital partners, co-investors to increase impact? And if so, how do you go about doing that? I mean, is that something you guys look at?
Yeah, that's something I would like us to do a better job at. We've always, when I say always, the Ford Foundation is a very collaborative organization. What we'd like to get better at is reaching out beyond our network of foundation collaborators and reach out into the private sector. We've got a recent example of that where we recently partnered with Morgan Stanley to create, through another pool of capital we have, the program-related investment was the pool that we chose to use in this case. And we're also having discussions with other private sector players, but that's one of the things that is on the measurements of success. So we expect to become more active in that in the very near term.
Excellent. All right, next question. And I think this is an interesting one, actually. Performance metrics for the investment side are well known. Do you follow any standardized criteria to judge the social impacts of your commitments? Do you apply cost-benefit analysis as would be used to evaluate public policies, or do you have some other custom model? How do you guys kind of decide how much impact an investment has and then weigh that against other factors?
Yeah, so we follow the same practices for measuring financial success, risk-adjusted return on investment. And from an impact perspective, we have decided to take a very simple approach. There are those who may spend a lot of time refining sort of impact measurement models, and that's great for some people. These problems are so large that something as simple as preserving and increasing the supply of affordable housing is good enough for us. So we haven't yet spent a lot of time on coming up with a long list of measurements, because these problems are just so huge that we think putting money to work to try to address some of the big social problems, at least at the moment, is worthy of our attention right now. As time goes on, we will evaluate, review, refine, and we may become more detailed in our measurement and metrics.
Okay. Had a question about how are you currently integrating racial justice and ESG strategies into both MRI and the Foundation's overall portfolio? And what are your future growth plans for those particular strategies?
Yeah. So because I am focused on the mission investments program, I have taken the approach, my team, everything we do, like the rest of the foundation, has a race lens. We are a new program. It was launched in 2017. I joined in early 2018 to really get so I was able to draft off the very hard work that I'm going to name two of my colleagues, Christine Looney, Megan Thompson, who really rolled out the red carpet for me to walk on when I got to the Ford Foundation. And all their work is around including a race lens through everything we do. And so that's, and we collaborate with other teams at the Ford Foundation to do the same thing.
This is an interesting question. Specifically, what actions do you direct management to take to treat employees as valuable assets and not fungible expenses?
Yeah, so we are, at the moment, we are working with just one private equity fund manager, meaning we have our capital committed to one fund manager thus far, but we have a couple in the pipeline that we're working on. So for that fund manager, HCAP actually has in its term sheet a set of expectations around benchmarking. For example, what are the best in class, training protocols or benefits packages, et cetera, for peer groups, because it's going to be different for every sector. Not every sector can afford the same types of package, number one. Number two, as we work with the Good Jobs Institute, where Professor Zainab Tun is an operations research expert. So that's where we're really going to dig into the, what is your widget? How are you making it? How can you make it better? That's traditional private equity or good management work. And then secondly, how can we focus more on a shared prosperity model? KKR has actually done a pretty good job. There's a guy there named Pete Stavros who has been leading an effort where they've got a operational focus, which they've always had, and he's focused on the shared prosperity model because I think many people realize when you get everyone to think like an owner, you have the opportunity from innovation coming from every corner of your company. So all of a sudden, that person that you thought of as a low-level person, and we learned this during COVID-19, all those people that we thought were, they're actually the essential workers, right? They're the people who make the world go round. So hopefully now people can see the value. I think our quality jobs work is going to be a lot easier now because people understand the value of folks that they previously may have overlooked as being at the bottom of the and how much value they can bring when you actually allow them to shine. So Pete Stavros, KKR, they've kind of figured that out with their shared prosperity model, where there's a broad-based ownership perspectives, where all employees feel like people care about them. And in return, they get all the brilliance that you get from all those workers who happen to be at a so-called lower level. Maybe they're well, of course they're not making as much money as the CEO, but they actually see things that the CEO couldn't possibly see. That's our goal. Our goal is working at the nexus of superior operational design, superior human capital investment for a greater and shared prosperity model.
Great. So that kind of brings to the next question, I guess. The question that's written is, what are the major investment strategies and themes that are currently attractive? I think you've gone over the four basic impact strategies: affordable housing, financial inclusion, quality jobs, diverse-owned firms, right?
I skipped biotech, health tech, because that's a recently approved strategy. We're working on our first investment there, which I think we may finish up in the next couple of months. But yeah, that's that's a tricky. When we started out, when I joined the Ford Foundation, we had just two strategies: affordable housing in the U.S. and financial inclusion in the global South. And I worked with the board of trustees to expand those strategies a bit. That's how we added the diverse managers, quality jobs. And one of our trustees suggested that we look more closely at the global South to figure out what are the other big problems where we can allocate our capital. And that's how we got to the biotech, health tech. And Gates Foundation has been a leader of that for many years. So we want to be careful about not having too broad a strategy, but we think things are pretty set today. It's possible global South we may expand a bit, because quite frankly, the global South simply getting access to capital is impact in and of itself. So I'll stop there.
No, that's okay. I guess that would lead me. The follow-up question to that would be: how does a new you said you're probably going to live it anyway, but how would a new theme or idea get into the portfolio, into this list of approved strategies, right?
Yeah.
Process.
Yeah. So the approach we take is multifold. One, what are the areas where the foundation has intellectual capital? Broadly speaking, the foundation. Two, where does the team have unique knowledge or competence to potentially to be successful? Three, what are the areas that we consider, I'll use the term investable. Investable means what areas have established institutional investment managers that we can allocate capital to, where we know they have a track record of success achieving our hurdle rate financial return, or if there's not established firms, are there individuals who may be establishing a firm or may be convinced to establish a firm where we believe we have a strong possibility of success for double bottom line achievements that we need for our perpetual endowment objectives. So that's sort of the filter we go through. When the program is being tested, I think about 30 areas were studied, or maybe it was more. Actually, it's closer to 50 now. And honed in on affordable housing, financial inclusion. Affordable housing, the Ford Foundation was founded the largest nonprofit community development financial institution in the country. It's called LISC, Local Initiative Support Corp. By the way, LISC has a subsidiary, two subsidiaries in Chicago: National Equity Fund, which is a leading low-income housing tax credit syndicator and private equity investor in multifamily affordable rental housing, and then New Market Support Corporation, which is a small business investor that uses New Market's tax credit. So those are top of class organizations right there in Chicago. Ford Foundation helped found the parents of those two organizations. Number one. Number two, Ford Foundation made the first investment in Grameen back in the 1970s. So we're experts in affordable housing. We're experts in financial inclusion. We've got really strong capabilities in the other areas that I've mentioned. So we use a filter that is bespoke to our team and bespoke to the problem that we have identified that we'd like to try to solve.
That's interesting. A lot of food for thought for us other asset owners out here, for sure. I think this one will be a quick one. Do you use consultants? And if you do use them, how do you ensure that they're working in concert with your mandate?
We have decided not to use consultants. The Ford Foundation decided to build an investment team, many decades ago. And similarly, the Mission Investments Program, which has the mission-related investments team, we all have pretty broad competence, everything from public company CFO experience, investment banking, structured finance, straight plain vanilla investments. So we've got the competencies, we believe. are necessary. We leverage funds of funds, as I mentioned, so Fairview Capital Partners and Plexo. Our capital we invested over a period of time, so that $1 billion is just not all, full $1 billion at a time. We have roughly 100 million, just to simplify. So we can have a very steady, methodical investment process that we believe we can handle best in-house, because we think for us, we can best reflect the goals and objectives of the Ford Foundation from the Board of Trustees and the CEO by managing things in-house.
Okay, great. I've got a couple more. We've got only about 5 minutes left, so we're respectful of everybody's time. Do you invest in or have a view on opportunity zone funds?
So as a tax-exempt organization, opportunity zone funds don't offer specific benefits to the Ford Foundation. However, because of our focus on distressed geographies, a lot of our work can be adjacent to opportunity zone initiatives.
Excellent. Yeah, I figured that might be a quick one. So here, from a policy regulatory standpoint, what do you think would need to be changed to encourage non-mission focused investors to participate and invest in the same manner? Right. I think that's the last slide. You talked about it, getting other people to do the same sorts of investing.
Yeah, I think at the moment there may be a fair amount of for those who have the moral resolve, who believe in economic justice, and believe that mission-related investment or impact investing and appropriate returns are not mutually exclusive. Intentionality, so legislation is not required. It's really about taking action. And what Darren Walker did was he thought about the levers of influence. When he decided that he no longer was satisfied with not using more of our foundation's resources for double bottom line purposes, or I should say to advance our mission, so that 5% was no longer enough for him. The steps he took included talking with the chair of the board, talking with the chair of the investment committee, talking with the board of trustees, doing the homework. And all that required was his personal will. Where there's a will, there's a way. And so I'm not sure we need legislation. If we were to have legislation or even guidance around legislation, it would be something that encourages people to consider the type of double bottom line investments that are available. So while banking industry, banking had that redlining problem, we talked about the obstruction to African Americans, Black Americans. The Community Reinvestment Act, which is legislation for all banks, which requires capital, and I ran that program at Morgan Stanley. That is, good news, bad news. It's legislation that was created because of redlining, because of intentional efforts to keep capital away from Black people. The legislation itself had no mention of race. So it's all about poor people. And so what happens there is there's some flexibility as to how you want to fulfill your mandate around Community Reinvestment Act. Similarly, it's possible that legislation may be required for a lot of the ERISA players because there's a lot of fear around tripping over tripping over the laws and getting in trouble. The fear, however, can be overcome by intentionality and will. And so if leaders of institutions affected by the existing legislation, there may be some who are willing to figure out, okay, how do we thread the needle here to do the right and moral thing?
Right. Well, I think we are just about out of time. I don't think we can answer any of the other questions in the time left. So I just want to say thanks to Roy Swan for speaking with us today, and along with everyone that joined us for the webinar. We had a great group, a lot of really good questions. Thanks. If you have any questions about today's event, please contact the CFA Society Chicago office at info@cfachicago.org. And thanks again, Roy. I appreciate it. It was really good.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.